Our main story tonight concerns kids. You know, idiots. They don't know important adult skills like how to do taxes or have regrets, which is why, for years now, local news has been full of dumb teen trends like these.
They're apparently bringing back the Kool-Aid Man TikTok challenge that first started during the pandemic.
Oh, no.
If you don't remember, it's when teens mimic the commercial, pretending to be the Kool-Aid Man, saying, oh yeah, and then bursting through walls and fences.
There's another popular dare called the Kylie Jenner Challenge, where teens put their lips in shot glasses, they suck all the air out.
It's called the Banana Peel Challenge. The challenge may seem harmless at first, but doctors say it could really lead to serious injuries.
This TikToker drank nothing but food coloring for 11 days, just to see what would happen.
You may notice my skin is turning blue.
It should come as no surprise that trying to turn yourself blue is not a good idea.
Look, as far as experiments go, drinking nothing but blue probably isn't going to win a Nobel Prize, which is just as well, because we then have to watch a TikTok called I Ate My Nobel Prize just to see what would happen. The point is, young people can do a lot of dumb shit, and that can sometimes lead to them getting in trouble with the law, something definitively covered by everyone's favourite character, Pants Bear.
Pants Bear? Where did you get the candy from? I don't remember seeing that earlier.
I forgot I got it from the candy aisle.
But did we pay for it? Pants Bear, you cannot simply take products from the supermarket. That's stealing.
I didn't mean to steal it. Ah! Help! Oh,
Oh, no! For those unfamiliar, that is Pants Bear, a bear who, and this is true, wears pants. And so we like about the Microsoft Paint quality of the animation, that clip falls under my single favourite genre of entertainment, British bears face carceral punishment, so it was always going to be a 10 out of 10 from me. But the thing is, in the US, a kid ending up behind bars for accidentally pocketing a candy bar actually isn't that much of a stretch. And that is what our story is about tonight, our juvenile justice system. We've occasionally touched on it before. You may remember in our school police story, we talked about kids winding up arrested for crimes like throwing Skittles or having a tantrum. That's just one of the many ways for kids to fall into this system. And while it's true that some have committed serious crimes, far more often they're in trouble for things like vandalism, theft, or even so-called status offences like truancy or underage drinking, basically crimes that are only crimes if you are a kid. You may have even seen stories like the one about the 6-year-old who went to court for picking a tulip from a yard at his bus stop. The point is, our juvenile courts are busy. In 2022, the most recent year for which data is available, they heard just over 600,000 cases. That same year, over 130,000 kids were detained ahead of judgment, with an additional 38,000 locked up as a result of judges' orders. The US actually incarcerates youth at many times the rate of other nations. That's from the Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty, which is not a study you want to be on the leaderboard of. It's like hearing a urologist say, single weirdest one I've ever seen. That's how ashamed we should be. It's a topping the weird dicks list level of shame. And while we occasionally get glimpses of this system, it tends to be worryingly opaque. Juvenile court hearings are often closed to members of the public, which does make sense in a way. It's important to protect kids' privacy, but in practice, that creates a dangerous lack of accountability for the adults in charge. Because the truth is, our juvenile justice system has many of the flaws of our adult one, except the people running it have even more power, and the damage it can do is even longer lasting. So tonight, we're going to take a longer than usual look at two things: our juvenile justice system and the facilities it can far too often funnel kids into. And let's start with something that might seem obvious, but is still worth stating. Kids are not, in fact, tiny adults. They are, and this is true, kids. And research shows that in figuring out who they are and how they want to behave in life, kids often engage in exploratory, risk-taking behaviours that help them assess social, personal and familial boundaries. Or, to put it another way,
part of adolescence is testing the limits, and part of adolescence is not having the brain functioning to understand, gee, if I do that, it's going to get me in trouble.
Right. Kids are good at testing limits and bad at weighing consequences. Sort of like a puppy or a pre-Iron Man Robert Downey Jr. And we've long understood that kids need a system that takes their still developing minds into account. It's part of the reason why a separate court process was created for them back in 1899. And just watch this 1940s film, Boy in Court, which tells the story of a 15-year-old boy who helped steal a car.
Johnny and 200,000 other youngsters who are arrested each year are America's #1 crime problem. Can't something be done to help these twisted young lives and set them straight? Yes, something can be done. Something is being done. Many communities believe that good juvenile courts with well-organized probation service can make good citizens out of wayward youth. Fortunately, Johnny lives in a community which has such a court.
Yes, luckily, Johnny lives in a community with a juvenile court, as opposed to the other kind of community where wayward children are sent into, the maze. No judgments, both are good options, whether you're talking about rehabilitation or the maze. In that film, Johnny gets sent to probation, and his probation officer guides him toward youth sports. It's a process that all culminates in this happy scene.
Well, Johnny, Mr. Benton tells me you don't need probation anymore. You've made good. I guess you won't steal any more automobiles, will you?
Gee, that was dumb, wasn't it?
It certainly was.
Well, that is nice, although is that kid actually reformed? Hair slicked back, sharp suit. He may have just been upgraded to a higher class of crime. Stealing cars was a fool's game, Your Honour. I won't do that again, or my name isn't Little Bernard Madoff. But obviously, court never works that way for everyone, and definitely doesn't for many kids today. One investigation into this system has likened it to Plinko, the Price is Right game, where a chip can fall any number of ways depending on what it hits on the way down. And that is basically true here. At every stage, factors beyond a kid's control can propel them to vastly different outcomes. And unfortunately, many kids have no idea how to navigate this system or even what their basic rights are. For instance, if a young person is being interrogated by police, research shows they waive their Miranda rights at extremely high rates, as high as 90%, and may not understand the consequences of that. Take this woman who was arrested at 15 years old and unknowingly signed away her rights to an attorney. She ended up getting sent to a youth facility where she met another kid who'd been through the same court that she had, and they realised they'd both been denied something pretty important.
I said to my friend, I said, man, did you have, like, a lawyer? And she was like, no, nobody has lawyers. And I was like, but haven't you seen Law and Order? Like, everybody has lawyers. Like, you're supposed to have a lawyer. Like, that's what, if you don't have a lawyer, you get one assigned to you. Like, isn't that the... And she was like, I guess it doesn't work that way for kids.
That is ridiculous. Every kid in court should at least have access to the stuff they have on Law and Order. Which, as we all know, is a lawyer, 2 quippy detectives, a guy only loosely connected to the case but played by a suspiciously high-profile guest star so you know that they did it, a dead body being played by a Tisch graduate getting their big break, and, as always, an abrupt smash cut to the name... Exactly. You know, the usual. Now, without access to an attorney, she ended up being sentenced to 3 months in a youth facility with 6 months probation, all for the crime of harassment, which incredibly consisted entirely of making this MySpace page mocking her school's vice principal. And if you're wondering how on earth a kid wound up getting locked up over that, it's because the judge decided that she should be. That is the whole reason. Because in most cases, when a kid goes to trial, there is no jury, meaning the judge has sole discretion in deciding the fate of that child. And to be fair, some use that power judiciously to dismiss or divert cases, which can take many forms, including writing an apology letter, doing community service, or participating in counselling or treatment for substance abuse. But judges can also go the other way, placing kids in a youth facility or even kicking their case up to adult court. We do that for over 50,000 kids a year, which is actually down from its peak of 250,000 in the mid-90s, when there was a lot of bullshit fear-mongering about so-called teenage super predators. Back then, sending kids to adult court was actually a popular campaign promise for judges like this guy.
As judge, if given the opportunity to try a juvenile offender as an adult, I will. If you're a teen and convicted of murder, rape, or violent crimes against our children or the elderly, you can expect that I will impose the maximum sentence allowed by law.
Mark Chivarella, a judge to protect all of us.
OK, I have a lot of questions there, starting with, what on earth is he walking in front of? That setting doesn't scream, I'm a noble warden of justice, as much as my homemade Ninja Warrior training course fell down, so this is my backup career plan. Chivarella was the judge who sentenced that girl to 3 months behind bars over a MySpace page, and she wasn't alone. Over a 5-year period, he and another judge routinely committed juveniles to 2 private detention centres, in many cases giving out lengthy sentences for minor infractions, which sounds bonkers until you learn they allegedly received massive payouts from those centres, totalling over $2.7 million. It's a scandal that later became known as Kids for Cash. And when it all came out, the outcry tended to focus on the cash parts. But to be clear, funneling kids into those facilities, even for free, is not OK, especially when you learn some of those minor infractions included smoking cigarettes on school property, opening a yo-yo in a convenience store, pranking a school teacher by hiding her purse, and stealing a Hershey bar, which I will remind you is the exact crime Pants Bear committed. And we all know what happened to him.
Help! Oh, no!
Oh, yes, Pants Bear. In hindsight, you're just lucky you didn't get tried as an adult. And the fact judges have so much discretion means their individual biases can have a huge impact on sentencing. And one of the most glaring impacts is the racial disparities in who gets sentenced to what? 46% of kids who get incarcerated are black, even though black kids comprise only about 15% of the nation's youth. It's a discrepancy that this head of a New Orleans juvenile centre points out with some heavy sarcasm.
They're all African-American young black kids. Today my population's 100%. Yesterday my population was 100%. My population's been 100% most of the time that I've been here. We have an anomaly in Orleans Parish in that white kids don't go to detention. Apparently they don't commit car burglaries. Apparently they don't get in school fights and commit assaults. Apparently they're not selling drugs. Because if they are, they're not winding up in detention.
OK, any time the population ends up 100% all one race, something is up. That doesn't happen by chance. Even at a black wedding in a black church, somebody's got a work friend. There are so many stories of kids who face starkly different repercussions for the same activities. Take Eric, a 13-year-old boy who was watching a movie and saw someone with a Molotov cocktail. He thought it was cool and wanted to see if he could make something that looked like that. So he grabbed an empty bottle and filled it with household products. Then he taped it up with black tape and put a piece of toilet paper under the cap, which importantly is not a Molotov cocktail, just a bottle that looks like one. He left it in his backpack by mistake and brought it to school, where he was pulled out of class, questioned by police, arrested, and charged with possession of a Molotov cocktail, which he did not have, attempted arson, which it could not do, and carrying a dangerous weapon, which, again, it wasn't. Eric is black. And when his lawyer told that story at a conference, a white woman walked over and said, "My son did exactly what you described, though crucially, he faced a very different punishment as his school rearranged his class schedule so he could take a chemistry course." And there is just no clearer disparity in punishment than the one between gets arrested and gets class credit. And to see just how naked these differences can get, look at Rutherford County, Tennessee, where black children make up around 16% of the local population. But from 2010 to 2021, they accounted for 38% of those locked up by the county. And at that rate, you'd almost think they were making up reasons to put black kids into detention. Well, guess what?
All right, well, in Tennessee, a judge under fire for illegally jailing black kids for watching a fight back in 2016. The alleged crime, listen to this, criminal responsibility of conduct of another. But one of the problems, that's a fake law.
Yeah. Criminal responsibility for conduct of another is not an actual charge. And you can't just invent reasons to arrest people you don't like. Personally, I'd love to put whoever thought a cologne should be sponsored by Johnny Depp in jail. You have chosen one of the only men on earth who looks like he constantly smells like feet and ayahuasca. That feels like a crime to me, but at least I acknowledge that it isn't one. In the end, 11 elementary school children were arrested. And this all happened under a juvenile system run by Judge Donna Scott Davenport, who had set up a process under which even kids accused of minor violations must be taken into custody and transported to jail. And to hear her tell it, she was just doing what was necessary to stamp out a wave of youth crime, saying, "We are in a crisis with our children in Rutherford County. I've never seen it this bad." And calling herself the mother of the county. And I guess, in the sense that the Queen from Aliens was a mother, sure, I will allow it. Davenport even had a radio segment where she'd talk about how she had no choice but to do what she was doing.
I've locked up one 7-year-old in 13 years, and that was a heartbreak. But 8- and 9-year-olds and older are very common now.
OK, I'm not a judge, I'm not a criminologist. My expertise is mainly sitting behind a desk, digesting lactose poorly, and telling you which of these guinea pigs can get it. From left to right, yes, 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 and yes. That's a full house, ladies, but I am confident in saying that if putting 8- and 9-year-olds behind bars has become very common for you, maybe you are the one who should be in fucking prison. The point is, which judge you get is one of the big variables in the plinko board of your case. The next is what sort of punishment you get, because if a judge doesn't opt for leniency, they have a number of tools at their disposal, including putting you on probation. That's the thing that little Johnny got earlier. Some judges will give kids probation either instead of locking them up or for a time after. And on its face, it does sound better. Kids get to stay at home and, at least theoretically, get access to community-based support. But the terms can be so easy to violate, they can still end up behind bars for what amounts to standard teenage behaviour. A few years ago, there was a case in Michigan involving a girl called Grace. She'd been sent before a judge for stealing at school and fighting with her mother, and she was sentenced to, quote, intensive probation, which included a GPS tether, regular check-ins with a court caseworker, counselling, no phone, and the use of a school laptop for educational purposes only. She was also required to do her schoolwork. But this was all happening at the start of COVID and remote school, which, as we all know, was very difficult for some kids. Grace lost some of the support that she'd been getting at school and missed some assignments, and before long she was handcuffed and locked up because she hadn't done her homework. The judge called her a threat to the community, a characterisation that Grace strongly disputes.
Do you feel that at any point you've been a threat to the community?
No, because if we called every person who's taken something or every person who's got an argument with their mom a threat to the community, I'm pretty sure everybody would be a threat to the community.
Exactly, that clearly doesn't make sense, because if she'd done her homework, she wouldn't have been considered a threat. But the second she missed a worksheet, suddenly she's Tony fucking Montana. Studies have found that juvenile probation is at best deeply ineffective, and at worst it leaves kids more likely to recidivate. And yet the sad truth is, it is still preferable to the harsher alternatives, which brings us to the second part of this story, youth incarceration, essentially locking kids up. That might mean a juvenile detention centre where they await trial, like a jail, or a long-term facility after they've been sentenced akin to a prison. But a lot of these facilities don't like using terms like jails or prisons, preferring to go by state schools or academies or youth centres. But as this interview with the woman who oversaw this facility makes clear, those euphemisms are not fooling anyone actually inside one.
Taylor calls itself a center. The state lists it as a correctional facility. The leadership calls the juveniles clients, not inmates. One of the young men I talked to today said, they call us clients, but we're not clients. We're prisoners. You can call whatever you want. You're in a prison. Does he have a point?
Well, we do still control their movement. They are still certainly in an environment that we are in control of, and they're not. And that probably feels like prison.
And you have barbed wire?
Yes.
And doors that lock?
Yes.
In front of you and behind you?
Yes. One of the toughest things for my job, certainly, is to always balance the needs of the client and public safety.
OK, putting aside the use of the word client there, it probably feels like prison. Yeah, of course it does. It's fucking prison. Lots of people feel like prisoners, but they actually aren't. You know, people trapped in loveless marriages, or a camera's on work call, or a studio audience where the subject of the alleged comedy show is kids' prisons. But when there is barbed wire and kids locked up in a cell, it's not just a feeling, it's a reality. Because whatever you call these facilities, once you're inside, it is painfully clear what they are.
From the outside, it looks like an office building. But go inside, and it looks like a prison. These are single-occupancy cells, but look closer. This haunting picture shows who's inside. Children barely taller than door handles.
Jesus Christ. And honestly, props to that kid for turning the creepy factor up to 1,000. He saw someone with a camera and said, "Let me show you arseholes what it is actually like in here." Because that looks exactly like an adult prison. And typically, we tend to try and tone things down if they're designed for children. It is the entire business model behind Kids Bop. And Kids Bop takes a lot of shit But who else is changing the Macklemore lyric in Thrift Shop, probably should have washed this, smells like R. Kelly sheets, to probably should have washed this, smells like my baseball cleats? No notes. 12 states have no minimum age to be sent to one of these facilities, and some others set the age at 7 or 8, which is horrifying enough even before you discover what it can be like inside them. Just listen to this mother describe the conditions of a facility that her son was kept in Michigan.
They had flooding from sewage. My son literally called me and said, "Ma, there's literally poop," I can't say the word he said, "floating through the hallways, urine and feces."
Look, I really appreciate that she's going out of her way to be polite there, but if your child tells you they're living in a state-sanctioned shit river, you should absolutely be allowed to curse on local news. In fact, it should be actively fucking encouraged. One employee at that facility even said, "I would sell my soul if it was my kid in there to get them out, because the conditions are so bad." And while that facility has since closed, there are similar stories of unsanitary conditions all over the country. And the thing is, these places are supposed to be rehabilitative. But basic services like mental health counselling can be non-existent. It's estimated that up to 70% of youths in the justice system have a diagnosable mental health problem, but as few as 20% of them ever receive mental health services in there. As for education services, they are not much better. A child in South Carolina reported receiving only a single day of education over the course of 9 months. And a lawyer in Michigan said her young clients didn't have anything to write with to complete the schoolwork packets that they were given. And a mother there said that her son hadn't been attending school at the facility, but instead had received a word search to complete. And clearly, that is not an adequate education, although, for the record, that is also the only time that you'll ever find me bad-mouthing word searches, because that shit is fun. A letter mystery where your eyes are the detectives, don't mind if I do. I'm a word slut who loves to be right. Up, down, backwards, diagonal, it's Cirque du Soleil for your mind. And when you find a word that is not only diagonal, it's backwards, honey? Fuck me, stupid, I'm wet for that. So, it is hardly surprising. Researchers have found that detained students have significantly worse academic outcomes, with one study in Washington finding only 16% of detained students there graduated from high school, compared to 72% of non-detained students. And it's not just lousy buildings or a lack of services. There is also physical violence, sometimes actively encouraged by the staff.
30 Los Angeles County officers charged, accused of staging what prosecutors are calling gladiator fights inside a juvenile detention center. After video of one of those fights, first obtained and published by the LA Times last year, helped trigger an investigation. Parents of one of the teens, speaking with NBC Los Angeles, horrified at the footage. They say the guards appear to do nothing to help, even appearing to shake hands with one of the boys who hit him.
That is horrifying. Even the Roman emperor who invented gladiator fights, whoever that was, would look at that and go, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" Also, how did you get it to be light in there without a fire? Also, what am I watching this on? But mostly, what the actual fuck is wrong with you? And staff can be active participants in abuse. There have been multiple reports of staff in facilities doing things like withholding sanitary pads or allegedly withholding prescribed medications as collective punishment. And I won't even get into all the many examples of physical abuse that we found researching this story. Suffice to say, a guard at one facility in Florida apparently beat his detainees with a broomstick that he'd nicknamed Broomy. And if all that wasn't bad enough, which it very much is, some facilities also use solitary confinement, which, as we've discussed before, is widely considered torture. For kids and teenagers in particular, prolonged isolation can cause or exacerbate mental disabilities or other serious mental health problems. And yet, it has been used routinely. There have been reports of kids kept in isolation for 22 hours a day or more, often for days, weeks, or even months on end. Just listen to this man, who went through Judge Davenport's facility as a teenager, explain how he wound up in solitary.
Me and my best friend, we had gone out at night and we had opened up some unlocked cars.
They didn't steal the cars, but they did take some change. It was a non-violent offense. But Dylan was held in solitary confinement for 4 days, waiting to see a judge.
4 days doesn't sound like a lot until there's absolutely nothing to do. I mean, just go shut yourself in a closet for 4 days and you'll know what I mean.
Yeah, That would absolutely be torture. You try shutting yourself in a closet for 4 days. You will quickly lose your mind. Sure, you'll maybe initially check the back to see if you've got any chance of a Narnia situation, but even then, you're dealing with some needy talking animals and some pretty heavy-handed Christian allegory. You might be better off on your own. And remember, that wasn't even his punishment. He was just waiting to be seen by a judge. And this happens all the time, though some facilities won't use the term solitary, instead calling it seclusion, isolation, segregation, or room confinement. One even sent kids to what they called reflection cottages, which honestly sounds like a place on The Bachelor where the contestants go to masturbate. And some facilities can be pretty shameless about this. Take the Richard L. Bean Centre in Knoxville. It's known to lock kids alone in a cell more than any other facilities in their state. And here's its head and namesake, Richard Bean, laying out his general philosophy when it comes to juvenile detention.
And used to, we paddled kids. 1986, we stopped when the state ruled you couldn't. And had a lot of problems since then. We didn't have any problems when they thought I'd about half crazy. I'd whip 6 or 8 a year. And it run pretty smooth. What we do is treat everybody like they're in here for murder. And you don't have any problems if you do that.
You know what? I do have a problem, actually. And it's not just that your name is Dick Bean or that you have a literal kid jail named after you. It's not even that you smack your lips like you're recording ASMR for sociopaths. It's that you should not treat every child in your care like a murderer. And for the record, most of the kids in Dick Bean's facility are not yet convicted of anything. Most have only been charged with a crime and are awaiting court dates, and yet kids have been put in solitary there for things like talking back and forgetting to bring their books to class. But when local news spoke to the centre's board chairman, he saw nothing wrong with what they were doing.
It's not like we're putting them in a cage somewhere. They're in their normal bedroom. It's their bedroom. This is the solitary confinement. It's just go to your room.
What are you laughing at there, you deeply weird man? The only way that playful giggle makes any sense is if, just out of frame, a Keebler elf was tickling his balls with a feather. And while this is by no means the point, I just want to take a minute to address the episode of hoarders happening behind this man. What is going on in that room? I count 4 American flags, 1 aquarium for hanging dress shirts, 2 bookends with no books between them, a whole collection of elephants, 1 Trump doll, 1 Obama doll that either evens things out or makes things much worse, 1 portrait of Richard Nixon, and 1 actual Richard fucking Bean. What are you doing back there, Dick? Sit anywhere else. You're too old to be lurking in the background without suggesting some kind of Weekend at Bernie's situation's happening. Tennessee's Department of Children's Services has been documenting the improper use of seclusion at the Bean Centre for years, and yet they've continued to approve their licence to operate. And while Richard Bean himself is finally retiring later this year in the wake of yet another scandal at the facility, he's doing so at age 84, and not only will the facility stay open, this devilled egg is still the head of the board there. And that is the thing here. Nothing I've brought up tonight is new information. We've known about abuse in juvenile confinement facilities for decades. And it's worth remembering that if public safety is your priority, locking kids up by the hundreds of thousands just isn't the answer to that. Detention actually increases the likelihood that youth will be arrested and punished later on. One study in Washington State found that every additional day spent in detention increased the odds of felony recidivism by 1 percentage point. Meaning that locking kids up over the long run makes no fucking sense, as this critic of New Jersey's system points out.
95% of kids who are locked up here are black.
Brothers, you matter to us.
At a cost of more than $250,000 per kid per year. More than an Ivy League education.
Much more per year, much more than 4 years of an Ivy League education. And that youth coming out of these places reoffend at a rate that exceeds 80%. So we know we're buying a whole lot of failure for a whole lot of money.
Yeah, on top of everything else, this nightmare is not even cost effective. I can actually recommend a book that talks more about that. It's called The Purely Economic Argument Against Ad Hoc Child Torture, you know, if that's something you needed. The truth is, we don't do this because it works, because it doesn't. We do this because we want to. Because we're afraid of these kids, or we're mad at them, or we just can't imagine that they could be ours, and so we don't give a shit. There's even a pervasive sense that whatever happens to these kids in these facilities is somehow what they deserve, even if what happens to them is horrifying. Kids in Louisiana's Ware Youth Center reported enduring, among many other terrible things, sexual abuse from guards as the price for phone privileges or in exchange for food. Despite a horrendous pattern of abuse there, the DA had only prosecuted 3 guards in her 13 years in office. And even then, gave them all plea bargains to keep them out of prison and off sex offender registries, because she said she did not like the idea of burdening someone with a charge that they did not deserve. And when asked if the cases made her concerned about the safety of children at that facility, she responded, "We're talking about armed robbers and murderers, and these girls haven't even hit the age of 18 yet, some of them. Do I worry about their safety? No, I don't. I think that they're quite capable of taking care of themselves." And it is pretty telling who she's comfortable reducing to a label there. These murderers are fine on their own, but let's not call these poor sex-offending guards sex offenders. They have their whole life ahead of them. They can change. That kind of indifference is sadly all too common throughout this system. And if you want to see the tragic consequences of it from start to finish, take the case of Solon Peterson, a 13-year-old who was arrested after an incident at his school. His parents asked that he go to a mental health facility, but instead, he was sent to a juvenile detention centre. As it happens, the same one where those guards were sexually abusing girls. While there, Solon disassembled the light in his cell and was sent to isolation. Under Louisiana state rules, isolation shouldn't exceed 4 hours. Solon was kept in isolation for 4 days. At one point, he reportedly told a guard that he wanted to die, to which the guard replied, "If you want to be killing yourself, just do it." And I'll let this news story pick things up from there.
Solon took his own life in solitary confinement at the Ware Youth Center in Coshada. The 13-year-old was there because he'd set a roll of toilet paper on fire at Houghton Middle School. Solon's death raised serious questions about whether he should have been sent to Ware in the first place. He had no criminal history and was battling PTSD and ADHD with the help of new medications.
You know, we feel very confident in knowing that if Solon had lived 15 miles in the opposite direction, that he would not have been in this situation, because the judge in that jurisdiction would have made a different choice for his case.
Yeah, that is heartbreaking. And yet the Ware Youth Centre remains open. And if you're thinking, how can a system treat kids like this? I'd argue it's what happens when too many of us stop thinking of them as kids, some of whom may have done terrible things, many of whom haven't, and none of whom deserve this. Because look, we've all done stupid things in our youth. Maybe you shoplifted or committed vandalism or roasted a teacher online or got in a fight or, God forbid, opened a yo-yo in a convenience store. Any of the things that you've heard kids get in trouble for tonight, and maybe you didn't face lasting consequences. But it's worth remembering that, but for the variables of race or class or how the Plinko chip happened to fall, things could have ended very differently for you. So what can we do? Well, I would argue that the whole system I've shown you from start to finish here needs reform. When it comes to the juvenile justice process, kids should be provided access to legal counsel at every step of the system. If they want to waive their right to an attorney, it should only be after a discussion with one. And if they're going to be given probation, it should be designed in such a way that rewards and incentivises good behaviour instead of penalising a kid for every mistake they make. But in general, experts suggest diverting kids into things like family-focused multidimensional therapy models, mentorship programs, and investing in community-based interventions is in most cases the best approach. One of the most comprehensive studies ever undertaken in this field followed over 1,000 adolescent boys for 5 years after they'd been arrested for low-level offences. And it found that diversion isn't just better for the kids, it actually promotes public safety through reducing violence, which serves everyone. The good news is, there are lots of organisations that have been working hard to deliver those services. The bad news is, they're among the ones getting hardest hit by the Trump administration's massive funding cuts. Now, when it comes to incarceration, I will concede there are some kids who may be a threat to themselves or others and may, for a time, need to be in a secure setting. But even then, I'd argue any residential treatment they get should bear no resemblance to adult incarceration. I'd also argue that adult incarceration should bear no resemblance to adult incarceration, but that is for another time. That's for another time. To their credit, All these states have passed some rules or statutes limiting the practice of locking kids up over minor probation violations, which is good. And all of these and DC have passed laws aimed at improving conditions in youth facilities, though I will warn you there that cosmetic changes can be falsely reassuring. There have been numerous stories of facilities that bragged about new approaches like pet therapy and yoga, only for it to then emerge that they were home to the same abuses as traditional facilities, just with more brightly coloured walls. So reform can't be a discrete event. It has to be an ongoing commitment to reimagining this entire system. And for the final time, I get that some kids can commit heinous crimes, but our anger at those crimes shouldn't be the main thing dictating our treatment of those kids, especially when you consider kids' brains do change as they get older. Studies indicate that even psychopathic traits decrease with age in the majority of youth, whether they're involved with the justice system or not. The point here is, no matter what they did, kids deserve safety, respect, protection, and the chance to grow beyond their mistakes. They deserve to be treated like individuals with potential and value, even, and I would argue especially, on their worst days. Being an adult is hard. Becoming one is even harder. And we need to work as diligently as we can to make sure that we are not wrecking kids' lives by mindlessly throwing them into these prisons or academies or youth centres or freedom-challenged inside yards or whatever the fuck you want to call them. And if we can do this, then hopefully one day we'll be able to look back on this absolute disgrace of a system as a thing of the past, and just like happy reformed Johnny say, gee, that was dumb, wasn't it?